The hall was big enough to hold a city inside it. The ceiling was so high that the upper parts disappeared into a soft blue mist. Thousands of seats curved around a central platform in wide rings, and every seat was filled. Beings of all shapes and sizes sat, floated, or stood in their places. Some had 4 arms, some had no eyes. Some breathed gases that had to be pumped through their personal helmets. But all of them had come to the same place, for the same reason, on the same day. The Grand Convocation Hall of the Interstellar Covenant was the most important room in the known galaxy. And today, it was about to make a very serious mistake. The session had been running for 3 hours already. The lead speaker was Ambassador Drevoth of the Vethri Dominion. He was tall, with gray skin that caught the light in a way that made him look like he was carved from stone. His voice was smooth and calm, and carried easily across the hall, without needing amplification. He had the kind of voice that made people believe things without thinking too hard about them. "The situation is simple," Drevoth said, gesturing toward the large star map projected in the air above the platform. A small yellow star sat near the edge of the map, circled in red. A new species has been detected in this region. They call themselves humans. They live on a single world, orbiting a minor star. They have been traveling in space for fewer than 300 years. By every metric we use to measure civilizational development, they are infants. A murmur went through the hall. Not a disagreeing murmur, an agreeing one. "Their solar system is rich," Drevoth continued. 4 rocky planets, 2 with usable minerals, a gas giant with 17 harvestable moons, and their home world extraordinary. Water covering most of the surface, thick atmosphere, dense biological diversity, worth more than a dozen average resource zones combined. Now the murmur was louder, more interested, more hungry. "The Subjugation Charter," Drevoth said, holding up a flat silver document, "is a legal instrument already approved by 31 council members in preliminary committee. It classifies humans as a pre-sovereign species, non-citizens of the Covenant. Their territorial claims become null. Their solar system becomes open for proper civilizational use." He paused. "Let the room sit with that for a moment. It is not cruelty, it is order. We have done this 11 times before. We will do it cleanly, efficiently, and without unnecessary conflict." More than half the hall was nodding. The vote was about to be called. That was when the sound came from the observer's tier. The observer's tier was the highest ring of seating in the hall. It was not for voting members. It was for beings who had been granted the rare status of eternal witness civilizations or individuals so ancient that the Covenant kept them present simply as living records. They never spoke during sessions. They had not been expected to speak today. The sound was slow, heavy, like stone being dragged across stone. It was the sound of a chair moving. Everyone looked up. The being that rose from the observer's tier was not large. It was not physically impressive. It looked almost like a statue, gray and textured, with a body that seemed to be made of both organic material and something harder, like crystal grown through rock. Its face had 2 deep-set eyes that glowed with a faint amber light. It moved slowly, and every step it took produced that same low, heavy sound. Its name was Oruvael. The hall went completely silent. Even Ambassador Drevoth stopped talking. Oruvael had been present in the Covenant's records for longer than most of the species in the room had existed. The oldest council members knew its name from ancient texts. A few of the younger races had never heard of it at all, and were now quietly asking their neighbors in confused whispers. Those neighbors were responding with very wide eyes. Oruvael did not use a microphone. It did not need one. When it spoke, its voice seemed to reach every corner of the hall at the same volume, as though the sound came from the walls, and the floor, and the air itself. "I will say this once," it said. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. "I am old," Oruvael said. "I do not say that to impress you. I say it so that you understand what I am about to tell you comes from watching, not from guessing." It turned its amber eyes slowly around the room, passing over the faces of hundreds of beings. "I have existed through 400,000 years of this galaxy's history. I have watched civilizations grow from fire and stone to ships that cross between stars. I have watched empires that seemed eternal fall in a single generation. I have seen things that no record in this hall's archives will ever contain, because I am the only one left who was there." Silence. Complete silence. In all that time, Oruvael continued, I have watched 41 different civilizations, each one powerful, each one confident, each one in possession of a fleet and a legal document, make the exact decision that you are preparing to make today. It paused. Its amber eyes moved to Ambassador Drevoth. They looked at the humans, or beings like them, and they saw something small and young and easy to take from. And they were right about the small part. And they were right about the young part. Another pause. They were very wrong about the easy part. Drevoth clasped his hands behind his back. He did not look afraid. He looked the way someone looks when they have already decided not to listen. All 41 of those civilizations, Oruvael said quietly, no longer exist. The hall erupted. Voices, clicking sounds, translated arguments flooding through communication earpieces. The noise was enormous. Above it all, Drevoth raised his hand and smiled. Respected elder, he said, his smooth voice carrying over the noise. We are grateful, as always, for your perspective. But perspective built on ancient history does not always translate to the present. The humans have basic ships. They have no energy weapons of consequence. They have no allies. They have survived everything their own world tried to do to them, Oruvael said. It did not raise its voice. Their own planet tried to kill them for 1,000,000 years. Ice ages, famines, disease, disasters that ended most life on their world several times over. They are still there. Then they tried to kill each other for 10,000 years without stopping. Wars over land, wars over belief, wars over things that no longer even exist. They are still there. It looked at Drevoth steadily. Do not provoke the humans. The vote was called 20 minutes later. The charter passed with 38 votes in favor. Oruvael sat back down in its chair. It did not protest. It did not speak again. It simply folded its heavy hands in its lap, closed its amber eyes, and waited. In 400,000 years, it had learned that some lessons could not be taught. They could only be experienced. The 14 warships of the Vethri Dominion dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system with the kind of slow, deliberate confidence that came from never having been surprised before. Commander Vethri Solus stood at the front of the bridge, hands resting on the railing, watching the star ahead grow brighter on the display screen. It was a small star, yellow, unremarkable. The kind that didn't even get a proper name in most Vethri star charts, just a catalog number and a note about its resource value. Broadcast the charter, Solus said. His voice was calm. Why wouldn't it be? He had done this before. It always went the same way. The communications officer sent the signal on every frequency. The subjugation charter, all 40 pages of it translated into the human language, called English, by the Covenant's translation database. It explained, in formal legal terms, that the human species had been classified as non-sovereign, that the solar system now fell under Covenant jurisdiction, that the humans had 30 standard days to begin the process of cooperative relocation from the moons and stations they had built in orbit and across the system, that any resistance would be treated as unlawful aggression against a recognized governing body. It was very official, very thorough, very impressive. Solus thought. He waited for the response. Usually there was panic. Sometimes there were desperate attempts at negotiation. Once, a young species had simply begun crying on the open channel. That had been awkward. The response from the humans came in 11 minutes. Solus put it on the main speaker. This is Admiral Yara Osei of the United Earth Defense Command. We've received your document. The voice was a woman's. Low and steady. No panic. No desperation. She sounded, Solus thought, like someone who had just been handed a slightly annoying piece of paperwork. We've also spent the last few minutes translating your fleet formation. Interesting choices. Please hold. Solus stared at the speaker. Please hold. He looked at his communications officer. The officer looked back at him with an expression that said, very clearly, that he had no idea what to make of that either. Scan their ships, Solus ordered. The scan results came back quickly. There were 9 human vessels positioned in the middle system. 3 were large, clearly warships by their mass and engine output. 4 were medium-sized. 2 were small and fast. The Vethri fleet outnumbered them significantly, and outweighed them in total mass, by a factor of 3. But the scan data was strange. Their energy signatures don't match any known weapon type, the scan officer said, frowning at his display. I can't classify their armaments. The system keeps returning unknown category. Likely primitive technology that doesn't fit our standard profiles, Solus said. It doesn't matter. Continue. What Solus did not know what none of the Vethri knew. Because they had never bothered to seriously study human history before moving on, it was that the weapon classification system used by the Covenant had been built to catalog energy weapons, beam weapons, plasma weapons, particle weapons. The kinds of weapons that advanced species built once they stopped fighting each other and started pointing their technology outward. The Covenant's database had no good category for what humans had built, because humans had never fully stopped fighting each other. They had gone to space, still mid-argument, still mid-war, still pulling technology developed for killing and pointing it at the stars. The guns on human warships did not fire beams of energy. They fired things. Physical things. Pieces of metal accelerated to terrifying speeds using electromagnetic rails originally designed to launch mining equipment across asteroid belts. They fired missiles that had started as orbital delivery systems for industrial cargo and had been quietly converted to carry warheads. They fired, in emergencies, anything heavy that could be loaded into a launcher and pointed at an enemy. It was not elegant. It was not sophisticated by galactic standards. It worked very, very well. Admiral Osei came back on the channel after 4 minutes. Okay, she said, still in that same calm voice. A few things. First, your legal document has a flaw on page 7, paragraph 4. You've classified us as non-sovereign, which under your own Covenant law means we are not subject to Covenant rules of engagement. We'll be referencing that later. Second, we are not relocating. Third, she paused briefly. Your 2 leftmost ships have moved into a position that suggests you're preparing an opening strike targeting our communications relay at Titan. I'd ask you not to do that. Solus felt the first small thread of unease. How did they? He began. Sir, the scan officer said, their smaller vessels have repositioned. They were already moving before Admiral Osei started speaking. They anticipated. Solus overrode his own uncertainty. 30 days of reasonable relocation time had been given. The humans had refused. The charter had been legally delivered. Whatever came next was their own fault. Fire on the relay, he said. The Vethri ships fired. The communications relay at Titan, one of the large moons of the outer planet, was destroyed in a single coordinated strike. It was clean, precise, a show of capability without full commitment exactly how the opening move was supposed to go. Solus watched the explosion on the screen and waited for the desperate back-channel communication that usually followed. The cry for negotiation. The apology. Instead, Admiral Osei's voice came back on the channel. You hit the relay, she said. We moved the actual communications equipment out of it 2 hours ago when we saw your fleet formation suggested you'd target it first. You destroyed an empty metal box. Another short pause. That's fine. I just wanted you to know. Then the human ships moved. They did not move defensively. They did not spread out or take protective positions or begin broadcasting emergency signals. They moved forward, toward the Vethri fleet. All 9 of them, accelerating hard, directly into a force that outmassed them 3-1. On the bridge, one of Solus's junior officers said, very quietly, "Why are they coming toward us?" Nobody answered him, because nobody had an answer. In Oruvale's silent chamber back on Velkarath, the ancient being sat perfectly still in its chair, eyes closed. It was not watching. It did not need to. It already knew how this part of the story went. It had seen it 41 times before. The battle did not look like what the Vethri had expected. In every engagement the Dominion had fought before, there was a shape to things. An opening move, followed by a response, followed by a counter, like a formal dance that both sides already knew the steps to. There were rules, even in war. Unwritten ones, but real. You targeted military assets. You broadcast warnings before escalating. You gave the enemy time to process each move and decide whether they wanted to continue or surrender. It kept things manageable. It kept losses on both sides within calculable limits. The humans did not fight that way. The first thing Admiral Osei did once her ships were inside striking range, was not target the Vethri warships. She targeted the 3 large Vethri support vessels, sitting at the rear of the formation, the ships carrying fuel, replacement parts, and long-range communication equipment. They were not combat ships. In any normal engagement, no one attacked the support vessels first. It was simply not done. The support ships were considered off-limits until the actual warships had been properly contested. Within 6 minutes, all 3 support vessels had been struck, not destroyed. Osei's ships had used precision strikes that disabled their engines and punched through their fuel lines without triggering full explosions. The ships weren't dead. They were stuck. Unable to move, unable to refuel the warships, unable to send communications back to Vethri space at long range. Commander Solus stared at the readout. "They hit the support line," he said. "Why did they? That's not a..." "Sir, they're weapons," the scan officer interrupted. "I've managed to get partial readings. They're kinetic. Physical projectiles. High velocity. The impact energy is..." He stopped, looked again at the numbers. "That can't be right." "What?" "The impact energy is equal to a mid-class plasma strike. But it's coming from metal rods. They're launching metal rods at us, sir. Accelerated through magnetic coils." He looked up. "They built rail launchers out of asteroid mining equipment." Solus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's insane." "Yes, sir. But it's working." 2 Vethri warships attempted to close on the human vessels and force a short-range engagement, where the Vethri energy weapons would have a clear advantage. The human ships split. One group drew the 2 warships forward. The other group looped wide, came around the outer angle, and hit, both pursuing ships from the side, with what scan data later identified as converted industrial cargo missiles, chemical propellant rockets, with fragmentation, warheads originally designed to break apart large asteroids. For mining, both Vethri warships lost their navigation systems. They were still armed, still crewed, but they were spinning slowly in space, unable to control their direction. On the open channel, Admiral Osei's voice came through again. "We're not trying to kill your crews," she said. "I want to be clear about that. We're trying to stop your ships. If you want to stop this, you can stop this. If you want to continue, we will continue. But I want you to understand something." Her voice stayed level throughout. Calm. Unhurried. "We have a lot of practice at this. More than any species you've ever encountered. This is not a boast. It is simply a fact. We have been fighting, in one form or another, for as long as we have been human. We are not going to run out of ideas." Back on Velkarath, the emergency session of the Covenant Council had been running for 2 hours. Ambassador Dravoth stood at the speaking platform looking considerably less smooth than he had the day before. He had received the battle reports in real time. 3 support ships disabled, 2 warships unable to navigate. A 3rd warship had attempted a broad energy weapon sweep the Vethri equivalent of firing in a wide arc to force the enemy to scatter, and had managed to destroy a small human communications satellite. The humans had noted the destroyed satellite, logged it, and proceeded to disable that warship's weapons array with a targeted projectile strike that punched straight through its exterior plating. "We need council reinforcements," Dravoth said. His smooth voice had developed a slight tightness. "A 2nd Vethri fleet is already being prepared. But Covenant support would..." "Would what?" said a voice from the middle ring. It was Ambassador Sella of the Selmoth, a small blue-skinned species who rarely spoke in large sessions. "Would it help? Because from what I am watching, the problem does not appear to be the number of ships. The problem appears to be the humans." "And..." Dravoth opened his mouth. "They are adapting in real time," Sella continued. "Every move your fleet makes, they have already anticipated or adjusted to within minutes. They use weapons that don't appear in any known database. Their commander has not raised her voice once. And they have..." She checked the battle report in her hand. "A grand total of 9 ships against your 14. They have not lost one. You have lost use of 5. A tense silence filled the hall. Someone, quietly, said what several others were thinking. "We should ask the Elder." Reluctantly, very reluctantly, a council messenger was dispatched to Oruvile's chamber. The ancient being was sitting exactly where it had been left. Eyes closed, hands folded, looking, as it always did, like a large piece of patient rock. The messenger delivered the council's request. Could Oruvael please explain what was happening? Could it provide context? Oruvael opened its amber eyes slowly. What do you want to know? It asked. Why can't our weapons stop them? Why won't they retreat? Why do they keep coming forward when the odds favor us? Oruvael was quiet for a moment. Because retreating, to a human, means giving up, it said finally. And humans do not give up. Not as a strategic calculation. Not as a chosen policy. They physically find it very hard to stop once they have decided that something must be done. It paused. Their history books, I have read, all of them are full of stories they tell each other. Stories about the ones who kept going when everything said to stop. Those are their heroes. Not the ones who were smart. Not the ones who were powerful. The ones who did not stop. The messenger stood very still. The 41 civilizations, the messenger said slowly. You said they all made this mistake. What happened to them? Different things, Oruvael said. Some were defeated outright. Some negotiated very poor peace agreements from positions of weakness. Some simply found that the cost of continuing was so high that their own populations refused to keep funding the war. It looked at the messenger steadily. None of them got what they came for. The humans kept their worlds every time. And then, eventually, they moved on and forgot about the attackers almost entirely, which the attackers somehow found worse than being remembered. The messenger returned to the council chamber with this information. It did not make anyone feel better. Outside, across the dark space between stars, Admiral Osei was already giving her next set of orders. She did not look angry. She did not look excited. She looked like someone working through a list of tasks that needed to be done, one after another, until they were finished. That, more than anything else about the battle, was the detail that appeared in every Vethri report filed that day. She just looked like she was doing her job. The Vethri fleet had 8 working ships left. Commander Solus stood on his bridge and looked at the numbers and understood, with great clarity, that this was not going the way it was supposed to go. 6 of his 14 ships were either disabled, drifting, or running on backup power after having their primary systems knocked out by human weapons. His remaining 8 were intact and still armed. His crews were trained. His firepower was still considerable. But the human ships were still advancing, still coming forward, methodically and without pause. And every time Solus tried a new formation or a new angle of attack, Admiral Osei seemed to have already placed one of her ships exactly where it would hurt the most. His communications officer spoke up. Sir, we're receiving a transmission from Vethri High Command. Solus took the message privately. The High Command was sending a second fleet, 40 ships this time. They would arrive in 8 days. 8 days. He looked at his 8 remaining warships and wondered if they would last 8 days. He decided to try the one option he hadn't used yet. Under Covenant law, a recognized governing body could invoke the diplomatic immunity clause during any conflict. It was a formal ceasefire mechanism once invoked. All parties were legally required to stop hostilities and enter a negotiation period. It was designed to prevent wars from getting completely out of control. Every spacefaring species in the Covenant recognized it. Solus broadcast the invocation on the standard Covenant emergency frequency. There was a pause. Then Admiral Osei's voice came back. We received your invocation, she said. However, there's a problem with it. The clause is binding, Solus said. Under Article 9 of the Covenant Charter, Osei said, and there was something in her voice that Solus could not quite name. Not satisfaction exactly, more like someone who had done their homework and was about to demonstrate it. The diplomatic immunity clause applies to conflicts between recognized sovereign members of the Covenant and other recognized parties. She paused. On the day your fleet arrived, you delivered the subjugation charter to us. That charter, which was signed by 38 council members, legally classified the human species as non-sovereign, non-members, not recognized parties. Another pause. Under Covenant law, the diplomatic immunity clause does not apply to non-sovereign entities. Those are the Covenant's own words, not ours. Solus was very still. You read the charter, he said. Every page, Osei said. Our legal team finished the full analysis 4 hours after you delivered it. We flagged that clause on the same day. A brief pause. Page 7, paragraph 4. I mentioned it when we first spoke. You may want to write that down. Back on Velkarath, when the council received the transcript of this exchange, the chamber was completely silent for almost a full minute. Then Ambassador Sella of the Selmoth said, very quietly, "They read it. In one day, they read it and found the loophole. They had translators," Drevoth said. But his voice lacked conviction now. "So does everyone?" Sella replied. "Finding the loophole is not a translation problem. It is a thinking problem." Drevoth had no response to that. The Vethri High Command, receiving the news that the ceasefire invocation had failed, made a decision. It was the worst decision anyone made in the entire conflict, and it was born entirely from frustration and wounded pride. They ordered Commander Solus to launch a long-range strike, not at the human warships, but at human population centers on the third planet, Earth. The calculation, laid out coldly in the order, was this. Humans were emotional beings. They were attached to their families, their cities, their home. If the cities burned, the human military would be paralyzed by grief. The government would face internal pressure to surrender in order to stop the civilian casualties. It was, the High Command argued, efficient. Solus read the order twice. He did not feel good about it. But he was a soldier, and he transmitted the strike coordinates. 20 long-range missiles launched from the Vethri warships, aimed at 3 population centers on Earth's surface. Their flight time was estimated at 90 minutes. At the 50-minute mark, every single missile was gone. Not evaded, not deflected, destroyed. All 20 of them, intercepted by human defense platforms, positioned in deep space platforms that, Solus realized, with a cold feeling in his stomach, had been repositioned days ago. Before the battle had even properly started, the humans had anticipated this, or something like this, and had quietly moved their defense grid to cover the approach angles before they were needed. Admiral Osei came on the channel again. Her voice had changed. Only slightly. It was still calm, still level, but something in it was harder than before. "You just tried to hit civilians," she said. "I want you to understand something. You had 9 functioning ships facing us before that decision. You now have 8, because the ship that launched the first wave of those missiles had a targeting malfunction we introduced into your navigation network 3 days ago, and we just activated it. That ship is now moving away from this system at maximum speed, with no way to stop." A pause. "We are not going to talk about a ceasefire anymore. We are going to talk about surrender terms. You have 20 minutes to decide." Solus sat down in his command chair. His hands, he noticed, were shaking slightly. He thought about the Second Fleet. 40 ships. 8 days away. He thought about Admiral Osei, who had already planned for things that hadn't happened yet. He thought about Oruvale's voice in the council hall. Quiet. Patient. 400,000 years old. "Do not provoke the humans." He transmitted his surrender. Admiral Osei's response was immediate. The human ships stopped their advance. No celebration. No threatening posturing. Just a simple, clear set of instructions. Power down weapons. Hold position. Wait for a boarding team. Solus followed every instruction. The boarding team arrived in a smaller human vessel 40 minutes later. The officer who led the team into Solus's bridge was a young man, perhaps 30 years old by human standards. He wore a plain gray uniform with no decorations. He carried no visible weapon. He looked at Solus with no anger, no triumph, no visible emotion at all. "Commander," he said, with a small, polite nod. "I'm Lieutenant Adeyemi. We'll be taking custody of the fleet until the diplomatic process is sorted out. Is there anything your crews need? Medical attention? Food? Water?" Solus stared at him. "You're asking if we need anything." Solus said. "Yes, sir. Your crew didn't choose to be here. No reason for them to be uncomfortable." Adeyemi glanced around the bridge with a calm, practical eye. Nice ship, by the way. Solus had spent his entire career in the Dominion's military. He had studied conflict theory, tactics, the psychology of defeated enemies. He understood intimidation through force, through superior firepower, through legal pressure. He had never once encountered anything like this. A quiet young man with no weapons, asking if he was hungry, while the entire Vethri fleet sat disabled in human space. He found, to his complete surprise, that this frightened him far more than the battle had. 6 months passed. The Interstellar Covenant had never moved so quickly in its entire history. Emergency committees were formed, dissolved, and reformed. Legal scholars from a dozen species worked around the clock to untangle the mess that the subjugation charter had created. The Vethri Dominion was formally censured. Ambassador Dravoth resigned his position quietly and was never heard from in the council again. Commander Solus and his crews were returned home, unharmed. The disabled Vethri warships were repaired by human engineers, who apparently found the experience interesting and returned to Dominion space with no weapons modifications or tracking devices installed, a fact that the Dominion's security team checked for obsessively and could not quite believe. The subjugation charter was struck from Covenant law entirely. And then the Council did something it had done only 6 times in its entire multi-thousand-year history. It offered a permanent seat. There were 47 member species in the Covenant. All of them were voting members. But only 6 held permanent seats, a status that meant their vote could not be overruled by collective majority on matters affecting their own sovereignty. It was a recognition given to civilizations considered foundational to the Covenant's future. Civilizations that would be present for a very long time. Humanity was offered the 7th. Admiral Yara Ose was part of the delegation that traveled to Vel-Karath to accept the seat. She wore her dress uniform dark blue, with a single silver pin marking her rank. She walked into the grand convocation hall and looked up at the vast ceiling and the rings of seats filled with beings from across the galaxy. And she did not look awed. She looked thoughtful, like she was trying to remember details so she could describe them accurately to someone later. The ceremony was brief. The Covenant speaker placed the permanent member's seal into the hands of Earth's senior diplomat, Ambassador Kwame Boateng, a gray-haired man with a very calm face. He accepted it with a small nod, said thank you in the Covenant's common language, a phrase he had clearly practiced until it was perfect, and sat down in the seat that had been prepared for the human delegation. Several council members who had voted for the charter watched this from their seats and said nothing. In the weeks that followed, scholars and diplomats from across the Covenant came to study the humans not as a threat to be countered, but as something they genuinely did not understand. They asked questions. They read reports. They brought their best analysts. What they found did not fit their existing models. There was a team from the Dran Collective, one of the oldest spacefaring races, who spent 3 weeks reviewing human military history. Their final report was 40 pages long, and its conclusion translated into the Covenant's common language said simply, "We do not have a category for this. Every model we use to predict civilizational behavior assumes that at some level of loss, a species chooses to stop. We cannot find that level in human history. We are not sure it exists." A researcher from the Selmoth reviewed human literature, their stories, their history books, their philosophical writing, and came back looking slightly shaken. She reported that the word that appeared most consistently across human writing, in almost every language and every historical period, was a word that translated approximately as despite. Despite the cost, despite the odds, despite the failure, despite the loss. It showed up in their war records, their science journals, their religious texts, their love stories. It was, she said, the single most human word she had found. None of this was entirely surprising to Oruvail, who had been sitting in its chamber for all 6 months, receiving occasional visitors but mostly just sitting. The council sent a formal delegation to see it. Not a messenger this time. The council's speaker came personally, accompanied by 6 senior ambassadors. They sat in chairs that had been brought into Oruvail's chamber, and the ancient being opened its amber eyes and looked at them with something that might have been patience, or might have been mild amusement. "We have questions," the speaker said. "I know," said Oruvail. "You said 41 civilizations made this mistake. All 41 failed." The speaker leaned forward. "We want to understand. Did the humans always win?" "Not always quickly," Oruvail said. "Some of those conflicts lasted a very long time. One lasted for nearly 200 years. But yes, the humans always came out of it holding what was theirs, usually more." It paused. The last civilization to try seriously was called the Vorchi. They were much more advanced than the Vethri. Larger fleet, better weapons. They attacked human settlements in 3 different systems simultaneously. A pause. The humans fought on all 3 fronts for 40 years. Silence in the chamber. 40 years, one of the ambassadors repeated. They rotated their military personnel, so no individual had to fight for more than 2 years at a time, Oruvile said. They kept building ships throughout the war, even when the raw material costs were enormous. They had periods of significant loss. There were years where things looked very bad for them. There were human leaders who tried to negotiate peace from a position of weakness. Their own populations removed those leaders and replaced them with ones who disagreed. It looked at the speaker steadily. They do not process loss the way other species do. Loss, for most species, produces despair. For humans, loss most often produces anger and then acceleration. They go faster after a defeat, not slower. The speaker was quiet for a moment. Then it asked the question that had been sitting in the back of the room since everyone arrived. The 41 civilizations that tried this, it said carefully. What do the humans think of them now? Oruvile was silent for a long moment. That, it said, is the part I have always found most remarkable. It turned its amber eyes toward the window, looking out at the dark between the stars. Most of them, it said, the humans do not remember at all, not because they chose to forget, simply because time passed, and other things happened, and the civilizations that attacked them were not interesting enough to keep thinking about. It paused. The Vorchi, the ones who fought them for 40 years, appear in human history books in approximately 4 sentences. The chapter is titled, The Outer Conflicts. It is considered a minor period. Nobody in the room spoke. They did not hate them, Oruvile continued quietly. They did not celebrate defeating them. They recorded what happened, built memorials for their own dead, and moved on to the next thing. That is what I have been trying to explain for 400,000 years, and that is what no one ever believes until they have seen it themselves. It turned back to the speaker. The humans are not dangerous because they are powerful. They are dangerous because they are continuous. They do not stop being themselves, ever, under any conditions. And when something is done, when the thing that needed fighting is over, they put it down and walk forward. Back on Earth, in a small office in the defense building where Admiral Osei worked, she was sitting at her desk, reading through a new batch of diplomatic transmissions. There were 23 of them, arrived over the past 2 weeks, from civilizations scattered across the galactic rim. They had heard what happened. Word had spread, the way word always spreads when something genuinely surprising happens. None of the 23 transmissions were threats. They were all apologies. Some for past actions the humans hadn't even been fully aware of, boundary violations, ignored signals, small insults carried out quietly over years by species who had assumed the humans weren't paying attention or didn't matter. All of them were now, apparently, very eager to establish that they had always had the deepest respect for humanity and hoped that a positive relationship could be built going forward. Osei read through them with the same expression she wore when reviewing supply requisitions. She set them in a pile on her desk. She would pass them to the diplomatic office in the morning. They would send polite, measured responses, offers of open dialogue, invitations to establish contact through proper covenant channels. She pulled up a new file on her screen. There were 6 new systems that human exploration ships had been surveying for the past year. 2 of them looked very promising. Good stars, stable orbits, possible conditions for long-term settlement. She began reviewing the survey data. On Velkarath, in a great chamber full of empty chairs, Oruvile stood up. It had not stood up in a long time. Its joints made slow, heavy sounds as it rose to its full height. It walked to the window, the wide, curved window that looked out at the galaxy, and it stood there, looking at the stars. It had been sitting in that chair, waiting, watching, for 400,000 years. It had watched species rise and fall. It had given warnings that were sometimes heard and sometimes ignored. It had watched the same mistakes made again and again by beings who thought they were too smart to repeat the past. But occasionally, not often, but occasionally something happened that even Oruvale had not fully predicted. Not the human victory. It had predicted that. It always predicted that. What it had not predicted was the young lieutenant, with no weapons, asking if the defeated enemy was hungry. What it had not predicted was the admiral, who had fought with perfect and devastating efficiency, writing the Vethri crew's medical reports herself to make sure none of them had been mistreated. What it had not predicted was the diplomatic message Earth had sent to the Council after accepting their permanent seat, a short message, in plain language, that said they looked forward to contributing to a better covenant, and that they bore no lasting hostility toward the members who had voted for the charter, and that they hoped to begin working with all 47 species as soon as schedules allowed. They had won, and then they had immediately tried to make friends with the people they had beaten. Oruvael looked out at the stars. For the first time in 400,000 years, it was not entirely sure what was going to happen next. It found, to its considerable surprise, that it was looking forward to finding out. It smiled.